Let's get started. If you're just joining us, welcome to Winter Wild, presented by Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. A reminder that you can enable closed captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're here from an earlier session, welcome back. I'm John Kerwin, Program Manager for Visitor Experience and Engagement with the National Parks of Boston. Our next presentation is Hibernate or Migrate, Bats of Massachusetts and Their Winter Behavior. We know that many birds fly south during the winter, but what about some of our other flying friends, such as bats? Today, we learn about the different bats that live in Massachusetts, where and how they hibernate or migrate, and the current threats bats in Massachusetts face, including white nose syndrome. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter, Elise Stanmyer. Elise is a bat conservation biologist for the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. She fulfilled her childhood dream of working with bats after graduating from Hampshire College in 2014 and has continued to work mostly with bats since. Her current work focuses on the protection and management of bat populations on state land. We encourage you to send your questions to us throughout the presentation. You can type your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And checking. Elise, welcome to Winter Wild.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's staying warm today. Let me get my screen sharing up and running here. All right. So, like John mentioned, my name is Elise, and I work for DCR as a bat biologist. I'm just going to talk today a little bit about the bats of Massachusetts, what they do in the winter, and some of the issues they're currently facing. So, bats are the victim of a lot of bad misinformation. So let's go over some bat myths. Maybe you have heard of these before. Bats are just mice with wings. Bats are blind and will fly into your hair. Bats want to drink our blood. Bats are mean, dirty, and full of disease. And are bats actually important? Let's talk about it. So, bats are not just mice with wings. Bats are actually more closely related to primates than rodents. And so there's the name of their scientific order, which is Chiroptera. It means hand wing. And fun fact, if you study bats, you are referred to as a chiropterologist, which I think is a pretty cool name. So if you can see in this little diagram, you can see the 5 fingers there with the thumb up at the top. And so the fingers are all splayed out, and then the wing tissue grows between them. And so bats are actually the only mammal capable of true flight. And did you know that bats can actually live over 20 years in the wild? I think the oldest known living wild bat was 41 years old, which is pretty crazy. They're one of the only animals that has such a small body size and can live for such a long time. Oh, so bats are not blind. If you see this cute little spectacled flying fox over there, he's got pretty big eyes. A lot of bats can actually see as well or better than humans. And a lot of bats use echolocation to navigate. So if you see this little diagram down here, bats send out a ultrasonic vocalization, and then they listen to the echo. And so bats are really agile, even though their flight may appear erratic. You know, people are always afraid of bats getting stuck in their hair or something like that. But they're really good at flying. I've been in caves before with, 50,000 bats, and not a single bat is going to bump into me because they're so good at navigating. Most bats don't drink blood. There are over 1,300 species of bats, and only 3 of them are vampire bats. So vampire bats are not in Massachusetts. And out of the 3 species of vampire bats, only 2 of them actually actually, I believe only one of them feeds from mammals. The other two feed on birds. So most bats eat insects. However, some of them can eat fruit, pollen, fish, frogs, lizards, birds, and even other bats, which is a little scary. And the bats in Massachusetts generally only feed on insects, although there has been reports that some bats eat other bats here in Massachusetts. So bats are clean, curious, and social creatures. Oops, what's going on here? Okay. Bats spend a lot of time grooming themselves and other bats. Actually, they did a research study on one of our bat colonies here in Massachusetts, and they found besides sleeping and feeding that the bats spent most of their time grooming. So they will groom each other, and usually, you know, they have really nice, silky, soft fur. Less than 0.5% of bats carry rabies. So rabies is not super common in bats. I am vaccinated against rabies, but even getting bitten by a bat is pretty hard. Most of their teeth, at least here in the Northeast, aren't big enough to pierce your skin, and we're usually wearing gloves. And actually, the bat species that most commonly is found to have rabies is a bat that most people aren't really going to encounter on a regular basis. So some bat species are known to create and maintain decade-long relationships with other bats. So I've seen some of these bat friendships in real life. You know, we put transmitters on bats and we track them. And a lot of them will stay with the same group of bats time and time again. You see them moving to their different roosting areas together. It's actually pretty cute. So there are over 12 species of bats that actually sing, just like birds. So these are ultrasonic songs, which is kind of why we're just learning about it now, but they sing for the same reason as birds do, which is usually some kind of mating purpose. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, what was I gonna say? Oh, there's actually some really cool research that's been coming out recently that maybe you've seen on the news, talking about bats babbling like babies, well, human babies, that is. So bats actually probably learn language in a similar way that humans do, and they start off by babbling. So are bats actually important? I, of course, think bats are important. Bats are everywhere, and they actually make up 25% of all mammal species. That's wild. I think rodents are the only other animal that has more than bats when it comes to mammals, that is. And the only continent without bats is Antarctica. So bats are really great at controlling insect pests. They also disperse seeds and they pollinate plants. If you like tequila, you can thank bats because they are the ones who pollinate the agave plant. And so bat guano is actually one of the best fertilizers out there. It's really high, I think, in nitrogen, so it's pretty sought after. And I was reading something, I think bats actually save up to like $25 million every year for farmers because they take out so many of the agricultural pests. Let's talk a little bit about the bats of Massachusetts. So we have 9 species of bats here in Massachusetts, and we kind of like to lump them into 2 different categories. So on one hand, we have our so-called cave bats, and on the other hand, we have our so-called tree bats. So as you can guess, the tree bats tend to roost in trees during the warmer months, and the cave bats, most of them don't actually spend all their time in caves, but they do hibernate in caves. So the big brown bat is probably the most common bat that you'll see these days. These are also probably, if you have bats in your house, these are probably the bats living there. I like to refer to them as the pigeon of the bat world. But besides that, we have our Myotis species. And so as you can see, these are pretty much all listed as state endangered. And a few of them are also listed as federally threatened or endangered. And it's likely that more of them will be added to that list soon. So you can see, you know, where these bats like to spend their time. And today, we're going to be talking about their winter habitat. The eastern small-footed bat, which you can see in that picture on the bottom to the left, that's actually our smallest bat in Massachusetts. They're only a few inches big. They're very, very small. And then moving on to our next bats here. So these are some of our tree bats. And to the left there at the top, that is a hoary bat. So that's the biggest bat we have in Massachusetts, and their wingspan can be like a foot long. And those are the bats that might actually sometimes eat other bats if they can. But yeah, most of these bats, these tree bats, you're not going to see them too often because they like to hang out high up in trees. And especially a lot of them like real coniferous areas. All right, so let's talk about hibernation or migration. So a lot of people are probably familiar with the idea of hibernation or migration, but it's a little more complicated than I guess people probably think. So why might an animal even bother to hibernate or migrate? Well, today is a good example of why. If you're a bat, you're not going to be flying in a blizzard. So extreme temperatures, of course. A lot of animals can't handle real cold or real heat. Lack of food and water resources. So here we have two examples of animals that regularly either migrate or hibernate. On the left, we have our ruby-throated hummingbird. So there's no flowers in Massachusetts during the winter time, right? So these guys fly all the way down to Central America where they can find food. And then, for example, a lot of people think of black bears when it comes to hibernation. And probably they hibernate for the same reason a ruby-throated hummingbird migrates. And that is because their most common food resources aren't really available during the winter time. So bears actually eat a lot of vegetation, and they'll also eat things like insects and fish. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of vegetation available in this part of the country during the winter. Other animals might hibernate to conserve energy. And plenty of animals will migrate for reproduction purposes. So let's talk a little bit about hibernation. Here is a definition of hibernation, a state of greatly reduced metabolic activity and lowered body temperature adopted by certain mammals as an adaptation to adverse winter conditions. And we all know about adverse winter conditions, especially today. So let's talk about some of the bats that do hibernate. We have our big brown bat. So these guys will actually wind up hibernating a lot of the time in people's attics and things like that. We have our little brown bat, our eastern small-footed bat, our northern long-eared bat, our Indiana bat. So most of these bats, and our tricolored bat. Most of these bats are endangered right now, and I will get into that a little bit later. The only one on this list that is doing just fine is our pigeon of the bat world, our big brown bat. Part of the reason they probably are doing so well is that they're a real generalist species. They're really good at utilizing, human-made structures and stuff like that to both roost, hibernate, and forage. If you're ever outside in a parking lot at night and you see a bright light and there's a bat flying around it, chances are good it's a big brown bat scooping up all the insects that like to hang out under those lights. So more about hibernation. So here's a fun fact for you. The word for a place where an animal hibernates is a hibernaculum. And when we are referring to the plural, it is hibernacula. Where are some of the areas that these animals like to hibernate? A lot of people, the first thing that comes to mind is going to be caves. But actually here in Massachusetts, there's not a whole lot of natural caves. So a lot of our bats actually hibernate in abandoned mines. So of course, they also hibernate in caves. And a lot of bats are adjusting to use human-built structures, whether they're abandoned or not. We've heard of some of these endangered bats actually hibernating in people's basements. Another place is rock crevices. It's actually pretty crazy. The eastern small-footed bat, they spend most of their lives living in rock crevices. They're pretty hard to find too. I worked with them down in southern Illinois, and it was actually, you know, you were picking up rocks that were on top of a cliff, and they were just grabbing a bat. Bats are just hanging out underneath these rocks. So majority of a population of bats might actually hibernate in the same spot, which actually makes them really vulnerable, especially to things like white nose syndrome, which I'll talk about in a little while. So in order to find the ideal habitat for hibernation, the temperature and humidity has to be really stable and really in the kind of ideal range. So I think usually it's around somewhere between 32 and 49 degrees Fahrenheit. They need that level, and they also need pretty high levels of humidity. When do these bats start hibernating? Well, a lot of the time this can be weather dependent, and there's no hard and fast rules for hibernation, but usually between October and April is when these bats are going to be tucked into their hibernacula. It is interesting though, because some bats, well, actually, if it's a warm day and, you know, there might be some bugs flying around, they might actually come out of hibernation for a few days in order to feed, and then they'll go back to hibernating. All right, so let's talk a little bit about migration. So migration is the regular, usually seasonal movement of all or part of an animal population to and from a given area. So a lot of bats actually migrate to their hibernation areas. So for example, in Massachusetts, we've tracked our bats to caves or mine areas in Vermont and New York. And so tree bats are most likely to undertake longer migrations. A lot of times we actually refer to tree bats as migratory tree bats. And so our three tree bats here in Massachusetts are the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and the silver-haired bat. So, and these bats usually head south or towards the coast. You know, usually coastal areas have more mild weather and probably more available food resources. And you might wonder, you know, why do these bats migrate and not other bats? Well, it could be because, you know, migrating takes a lot of energy. And also not all bats are built the same way. Like I mentioned earlier, the hoary bat, they're these really big bats. They have a big wingspan. And they're also used to flying pretty high up in the air. And so these two things set them up for being better long distance flyers. So once again, energy expenditure, really important. So bats are probably most likely going to follow these migration routes that require the least amount of energy. So they've actually done some research where they find, you know, some of these bats might even be using wind currents, like to have their wind at their back might help them use less energy during migration. And you might think, how do these bats know where the heck they're going? So it's pretty likely that bats actually learn migration routes from adult bats when they're juveniles. I know, for example, birds actually, I think they follow magnetic fields, and this isn't true for bats. They actually have to learn where they're going. And so most bats aren't going to travel more than 200 miles, but still, for a tiny animal, that's a long journey. And migration, it can be a combination of migration and hibernation. Some bats will migrate for a little bit, find an area. If it gets too cold, they might hibernate for, a week or two at a time, and then wake back up and go back out and forage. And that's a picture of an eastern red bat to the left there. I always like to refer to these guys as like little furry dragons. You can see they have a really furry tail membrane. And when you're holding them, they'll wrap that tail membrane almost around your finger. But a cute fun fact is that if it's cold, they'll actually wrap their tails around them like a little blanket, which I think is very, very cute. All right, let's talk about some common threats to bats. Of course, misinformation. So, as I talked about in the beginning, bats get a really bad reputation. People don't want them in their house. I think the thing I say to people is that you don't have to like bats, you don't have to think they're cute, but you should respect them because they serve a really important purpose in our environment. So of course, like a lot of critters on the earth these days, climate change and habitat loss can really impact them. And as I mentioned earlier, bats can, like the entire majority of a population, might all be hibernating in the same area. So if somebody went into the cave or the old abandoned mine or knocked down a building, if you mess something up and the temperature is off, then, these bats have nowhere to go. So it can really affect them. And something that's actually a big problem for our migratory tree bats is wind turbines. This is also a pretty big problem with birds too. So you can see there, that's a hoary bat that had been struck by a wind turbine. We're not really sure why these bats get hit by these wind turbines, but if you look at videos, a lot of the time, the bats aren't just, they're not just flying by and not seeing the wind turbine. Most of the time they're flying around it, they're checking it out, they're curious about it. We're trying to come up with solutions to prevent this from happening. One of the big ones they use, we call curtailment. So bats are usually hit by these wind turbines on days where it's not super windy, and it usually happens while they're migrating. So if it's migration time, it's not super windy out, meaning the wind turbines aren't going to be generating a lot of energy. They'll actually shut them off to prevent, these collisions. And then last, but definitely not least, is white nose syndrome. And you can see there's a little bat with a white nose. What the heck is white nose syndrome? Well, white nose syndrome is a disease that affects hibernating bats, and it's actually caused by a fungus that we refer to as PD. You can see a map there. I think that's a few years old, but the bluish purple area is where white nose first started. So they think cave explorers called spelunkers might have brought over these fungal spores in their caving gear from Europe or Asia. And The first time they found it was a cave in New York, and it kind of spread out from there. So Massachusetts was hit pretty soon after. And as you can see, like the red spots, it's continuing to spread south and west. They think that some of the bats in the south will probably be okay because, you know, this isn't going to bother them during hibernation, but only time will tell how bad this is going to affect the rest of the country. So this fungus, it grows in cold, dark, and damp places. So what is cold, dark, and damp? Caves and mines, places where bats really like to hibernate. This fungus also loves. And the way it impacts these bats is that, you know, it grows in their noses, it grows on their wings and stuff. And pretty much what it does is it wakes them up during hibernation. And it burns up all their energy stores. And you can see in the bottom picture there, it also will eat holes in their wings. Bats are actually really good at bouncing back from holes in their wings. It grows back probably maybe within a month or so. But if you have been so devastated by this, you have holes in your wings, you have no energy left because you burned it all up, you know, things aren't going to go well for you. White nose is the #1 threat to bats, and it kills more than 1 million bats each year. In some sites where they found it, the mortality rates approach almost 100%, which is pretty crazy. So, white nose was originally found, I believe, in 2006. And as a result of white nose syndrome, all 4 of our bat species that spend winters in caves or mines were listed as state endangered in 2012. So the little brown bat, for example, used to be the most abundant bat in Massachusetts, but after white nose, their population has declined by more than 99%, the entire population. That's almost unheard of for animals. And, you know, what's crazy to me is a lot of people have actually never even heard of white nose syndrome. So, for example, there was one hibernacula in Western Massachusetts that had around 10,000 little brown bats when it was surveyed before white nose syndrome. When they went back into the cave after, you know, the spread of white nose continued, they found only 14 bats alive out of 10,000. Really, really depressing stuff. So there's several other bat species that have also been really impacted by white nose syndrome. And that's the northern long-eared bat, the eastern small-footed bat, and the tricolored bat. So, what are some ways that you can actually help bats? First of all, you're doing some of it right now. You're being educated about bats. You can learn more about bats and you can be an advocate for bats. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people telling me that they had a bat in their house and they hit it with a tennis racket or some other similarly terrible story. And it's actually against the law to harm bats in Massachusetts. So if you have a bat in your house, please don't hurt it. Usually, you know, if you find a bat flying around in your house, if you can open a window and take the screen out, shut all the doors, turn out the lights, you know, the bat doesn't want to be in your house, not in your living room. They'll probably find their way out pretty quickly. Something else you can do is honor cave closures and proper white nose syndrome prevention protocols. So this probably isn't relevant for a lot of people in their everyday life, but you know, some people do like to explore caves, you know, or if you have teenagers that might find that fun, maybe let them know, hey, don't go in there. It could be, you know, bothering the bats. If you've ever been to somewhere like Mammoth Cave National Park, They have little stations before and after, I believe, you enter or exit the cave that are designed to clean off your shoes so that you're not spreading these white nose spores. Another great thing you can do is be observant. So as I mentioned, a lot of our bats here in Massachusetts are actually endangered. And for example, the little brown bat actually loves to roost in people's attics. We frequently find them in old buildings. So you might not think, hey, I have some bats in my attic. It's not a big deal. But it could be true that this is a maternity colony of endangered bats living in your house. So if you have a group of bats living in your house, there's a spot on the Mass Fish and Wildlife website where you can report these bat colonies. Another great thing that's easy to do is to protect and enhance bat habitat. So what makes for good bat habitat? Well, you know, bats need a place to roost. A lot of times these bats like to roost in dead or dying trees. If you have a big dead tree in your yard and it's not, you know, a safety hazard or something, consider leaving it. You know, a lot of animals enjoy roosting or hanging out in these kind of environments. Something else you can do is, you know, control invasive vegetation and also focus on planting native vegetation. And you might be like, how is planting some flowers going to help bats? Well, as we know, bats like to eat bugs. And what attracts bugs? Plants, particularly native plants. So the more you can plant, the better. And something else really easy you can do is build or buy a bat house. I haven't had a chance to look at the questions people are asking me, but something I frequently get asked is, why are there no bats in my bat house? Well, bats are pretty picky about where they're roosting. And usually when they're roosting in these big groups, like in bat houses, it's where they're planning on having their babies. So that means they have to be particular. So the temperature has to be right. Your bat house should be getting a lot of sun, particularly here in the Northeast. It's good to paint your bat house black. You got to make sure that it's you know, easy for the bats to grip the inside of the bat house. They don't want a bat house that is too low to the ground. It's best if it's 12 feet or higher. They don't want any vegetation surrounding it because bats need to be able to drop out of the bat house and into the air to fly. And also keeping it free of vegetation and other stuff like that helps protect them against predators that could climb up there. Another question people ask me are, you know, what eats bats? A lot of things, actually. One big one would be owls. No offense to our bird raptor presentation later, but I think owls and bats are kind of enemies. But yeah, owls, things like raccoons might even eat bats. They can just grab off the wall. Snakes. I've actually seen a bullfrog eat a bat before. All kinds of things like to eat bats. Something else you can do is if you do have bats in your house, you can remove or exclude them in the correct way. So you're not allowed to just kick the bats out of your house, especially not when it is baby season. And there are a lot of like professional animal control resources that you can find online. I think the Mass Wildlife website probably has a list of them, but these professionals can help you get the bats out of your house safely without hurting them and making sure they don't come back inside. There are some things you can do yourself, like, you know, if you have some big browns that you don't like, wait until they're gone, you know, for the winter. And then you can use, you know, cover-ups, like any openings with screening or stuff, but definitely be aware of how you can help the bats, especially if they're living in your house. So it looks like we have quite a few questions here, so maybe we can get into them. You want to read questions off to me or?
Sure, Elise, I can, we do have a number of questions, at least 12, and would just share with our audience that if you could, there is the chat, there's also questions and answers. If you could put your chats, or if you could put your questions in Q&A, that would help both Elise and myself. So Elise, first one that I will pass along to you is, should bat guano be sterilized like manure or fertilizer, or if you're going to use it for fertilizer? Also, do you know how, which bat species how do you know what bat species may be living near your home?
Okay, so first of all, with the fertilizer, I don't believe you have to disinfect it. There is a fungus that grows in bat guano that can actually be pretty harmful to people, but there has to be really big piles of it. It has to be sitting for a while, and you have to be breathing it in. But something that I have heard you kind of have to do with it is let it sit for a while, kind of let it dry out, because if you use it fresh, I think it's too powerful and it can actually kill some of your plants. And as far as how to tell what bats are where. So a lot of these bat species aren't going to be interested in kind of like suburban areas. Like our tree bats really like kind of more wild areas. Frequently what you're going to see around your house is either going to be a big brown bat or a little brown bat. And some of the ways you can tell the difference between them, you kind of got to get up close, but like big brown bats are obviously quite a bit bigger. They might not hang out in the same numbers as little brown bats. Their poop is a great thing to look at. Big brown bat poop is going to be a little bit bigger than little brown poop. There's things in the bat world even, when we're catching these bats, some of them look so similar that we have to do things like measure their tragus in their ears or measure their ear length to know, okay, this is a northern long-eared bat and not a little brown bat. So it can be kind of difficult to tell what bats are what and where they are. One of the ways that I actually and my fellow Massachusetts bat colleagues study bats is by using what we call bat detectors. So if you're ever out and about in some of the state parks, maybe one day you'll see one of my bat detectors out, but it's like a little computer that's attached to a microphone up on a pole. And when the bat flies by, the microphone is triggered, it records the bat's echolocation call, then we can put that into software and it can tell us what species of bat is what.
Awesome. And just for our audience, failed to mention that so you can either type your questions into the question and answer, that window. You can also raise your hand and request to ask a question live. So there are a couple options. Great. So Elise, next question. How did you become interested in bats? I think that in your introduction, you said you became fascinated with them at a young age. It seems kind of unusual given all the myths about bats that are out there.
Right. So I've just always loved bats. I think for maybe a few reasons. I think of this TV show I used to watch as a kid. I think it was called Elmira's Castle. And there was a little character named Batley. He was this little bat wearing glasses. Also, a book that probably a lot of you are familiar with is Stella Luna, about, a little lost baby bat. And then also, I think the biggest thing was my dad was really into like wildlife and nature. And when we were kids, I grew up with a really big backyard in Central Mass. And we used to do stuff like throw pebbles up into the air and like watch the bats dive to go after them. So yeah, I just always kind of like thought they were cute and cool. It's really cool that they can fly.
Awesome. And yeah, much better than being scared of. Next question, if bats can see better than humans, why the echolocation? Just, is this just to help them hunt at night?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason is, you know, they can see pretty well, but yeah, it's a lot easier to find a moth that's flying really fast by using echolocation than your eyes. And, you know, other animals that can see pretty well, you know, like dolphins have eyeballs, but they still use echolocation. You know, it's just a better way for them to get around, especially when they're living in these dark areas and these maybe cramped forests or caves. I think it just makes sense for them.
Absolutely. Next question deals with bats and attics. If bats sneak into your attic, will it be able to find its way out if the opening they came in from is small, you know, or does size matter? Or could it become stuck up there?
So most bats are actually really good at finding their way. I was just reading a study actually about bat migration, where they actually, and this sounds kind of bad, they actually blinded some bats. This was probably a long time ago, but they blinded these bats, and these bats were still able to find where they were hibernating in a teeny tiny crack miles and miles away. And it was all thanks probably to a combination of listening to other bats around them and then using their echolocation. So they're usually really good at, you know, getting out of things like an attic. So they're probably not ever going to get stuck in there.
It's got to be a relief for people who occasionally do find or may find bats in their attics.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is sort of looking at where bats are within the food chain. So who within the animal kingdom seeks out bats for food? And what are some of the defenses that bats use to protect themselves?
So like I was saying, things like snakes and raccoons and stuff, I think those are more opportunistic kind of things. Like maybe a raccoon stumbles into an area where a bat is roosting and can just pull them off, you know, the wall. But really, in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be birds that are going after bats most often. And so owls and, you know, hawks and stuff like that. If you've ever watched some of the nature documentaries where there are these caves full of a lot of bats, these raptors will just wait outside, wait for the bats to come out every evening and then just pick off as much of them as they want. So definitely birds are the enemy of bats. Ways that they protect themselves. Well, you know, there's safety in numbers, kind of like a school of fish. Well, if there's more of us, then, you know, I'm less likely to be the unlucky one. They also, you know, roost in these areas like these little tree crevices that a lot of predators aren't going to be able to get into if they're roosting high up or in a cave or something like that. They do have sharp teeth and they will hiss at you. And, you know, they can fly pretty fast. So I think those are kind of their defense mechanisms. But a lot of times, you know, they can be kind of like sitting ducks, unfortunately.
Okay. Next one goes again to bats in people's houses. The person is asking, I had a bat living on the wall of my garage for 1 week. On one of the coldest nights, I saw that the bat had left. Do you think that the bat went looking for a warmer place to hibernate?
The bat likely did. So, you know, like I said, these bats hibernate. So a lot of them are actually pretty good at dealing with cold temperatures. Their heartbeat can go from 300 beats per minute down to 10 beats per minute during the winter time. So it probably just found a place that was a little more covered up than just, you know, hanging out on the wall. I know, for example, I was talking to the Connecticut state bat biologist, and she mentioned that somebody in their yard has a silver-haired bat that is hibernating in a wood pile. So they can find even a spot like a wood pile. You would never guess they're there, but they might be. So it probably just found a better spot.
At least tied to that, you know, I was stunned when I was reading, you know, facts on bats in Massachusetts, and with hibernation, it said that during hibernation, bats can slow their breathing rate down to 1 breath every 5 minutes.
Yep. So they slow down their heartbeat and their breathing and their metabolism. It's pretty cool too, actually. So bats still need to drink during hibernation, so they're not actually sleeping. They'll wake up every once in a while. They might adjust their location due to the temperature, but they'll actually drink the moisture off of like a cave wall, or in a picture I had up earlier, you could see the bats were covered in water droplets, so they'll actually drink the water off their fur.
Very cool. The next question is touching on the wind turbines you spoke of. Regarding wind turbines, wouldn't their sonar or radar help guide them around the turbines? Maybe they can't sense the turbines as well when the blades may be moving slowly.
Yeah, so that definitely could be part of it. But I think like with birds actually migrate at night. And most often, I've actually worked up at several wind energy facilities. If any of you have ever been out to the Berkshires and seen the wind turbines there, I actually spent 6 months working up there and checking out the bird and bat fatalities. But so the birds usually get hit on these cloudy days where it's not so windy, but with the birds, they just can't see the wind turbine. So it just comes down on them and it can take out, half a flock of red-eyed vireos. And I've never found a living bird, but several times we found bats that were still alive. And looking at these videos, the bats are curious about the wind turbines. They're flying around them, they're checking them out. There's been a bunch of different reasons, like why do they, hang out by these things, but it's probably just curiosity. They don't know what it is, they're investigating it, and then they, don't really realize that they're in the path of the blade and it comes down on them. So it really has to do with curiosity and not like, they're not like blind to it, so.
Yeah. Next question is looking at another potential threat to bats. Person asks, are domestic cats also a threat to bats as they are to birds?
Yes, definitely cats are a threat to a lot of living creatures outdoors. I'm a big advocate for keeping your cats indoors, or at least monitoring them when they're outside. But yeah, that's definitely another issue that faces bats all over the world is domestic cats. Okay,
next one is going to the white nose syndrome. Is PD a stimulant, and why or do we know how it makes bats more active?
So it really just wakes them up because it bothers them. So it grows in their nose, which I can't imagine is very comfortable. And like I showed in the picture, it can eat away at their wing membranes. So I think, they're irritated. And as I mentioned before, bats are really clean animals. They spend a lot of time grooming. So I think it probably, messes with their breathing. It probably hurts them and stuff like that. So it's really just waking them up during hibernation. And that's just how it kills them. They just run out of energy because they don't have enough fat stored up.
Okay. The next question, it's a question from Rachel said, I think you touched on this earlier, but can you talk about the myth that bats are naturally aggressive towards humans and the myth that they're a huge spreader of rabies?
Right. So as I mentioned, less than 1% of bats carry rabies. And, it's very rare, even in the bat biology world, which is pretty small. It's pretty rare to hear about bats that actually do have rabies. But bats are pretty chill animals. They'll yell at you if you get too close to them, and they will bite you if you grab them. But otherwise, you leave them alone, they're going to leave you alone. They don't really want anything to do with you. They're not going to come at you. Their first response is going to be fly away. That's the first thing they do. It's funny, some bats are definitely more aggressive than other bats. Some of them, when you're handling them, seem to be pretty chill about it, and other ones, want to like bite your head off. But yeah, they're definitely not aggressive, and they don't deserve the bad reputation they have as, you know, being totally full of disease.
Yep, oh, good to hear. The next next question will resonate with anyone who's been outside around dusk and have actually seen bats. And the person says, why do bats move in a way that appears erratic? I saw some once at sunset or twilight over water in a park, flying in that sort of jerky looking way.
So yeah, a lot of people will see bats flying crazy around them and think, oh, these bats are coming at me. And one thing that, is a fun fact is, say you're walking through a field at night and you notice there's some bats flying around, and you're walking, and then all of a sudden these bats are diving close to your head. You're like, oh my God, does this bat, is it trying to get me? Really what's happening is you're walking, and as you're walking, you're kicking up insects that are hanging out in the grass, and those insects are taking flight. And who's coming after those insects? The bats. And so usually when you see them flying crazy, and as I mentioned from my childhood story, if you throw a pebble up into the air where there's bats around, they can hear that with their echolocation, and they'll come diving after it. So when they're really flying crazy, they're just going after bugs. They're listening. They, might hear, oh, there's a big bat, a big bug over that way. And so they'll take off in that direction. And then, yeah, it's really just them following their echolocation and trying to catch bugs.
Okay. So next question, if somebody has a bat habitat in their attic, is there some public support available to help with relocation or moving the bats out? Asking because we have a family home in New York that has hosted a vibrant attic colony for more than 40 years. Thank you for supporting the bats. The young family living in the house would prefer the bats live elsewhere.
Right. So if you have this colony of bats that has been there for a long time, I would strongly recommend reporting it to New York's version of Mass Wildlife. I forget what it is. Every state it's different, but they'd probably like to know about it, because it very well could be an endangered little brown bat colony. And usually when they're roosting in big numbers like that, it's a maternity colony. So this is where they're having their babies. I'm not sure how things work in New York, but I know, Mass Wildlife does their best to follow up on reported bat colonies. And they can definitely give you recommendations for how to either find a problem animal control person, or give you some information on how you might be able to safely exclude them yourself. And there is some pretty strict guidelines for time of the year that you can exclude them and stuff like that. But there are things you can make, like a one-way exit, so the bats can fly out of the roost, but they can't get back into it. So we don't really ever relocate bats. We just exclude them. We just kind of evict them. In areas where there are these larger populations of these endangered bats, it's good to build some kind of bat house, or depending on how big the colony is, like a bat shed. And I know, probably the officials in the government in New York probably have some good recommendations on what to do, and if they are endangered bats, maybe figure something out with some kind of bat house or something like that. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with some wildlife officials in New York.
Absolutely. And I think if you look in the chat, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, may be a good place to start.
There we go. I was actually just at a bat conference a couple weeks ago, and the New York bat biologist was there, and he's a really, really smart, cool guy.
Good to hear. So next question, wouldn't it be unhygienic for humans if they live in the attic because of the bat droppings?
Yeah, so it's definitely not ideal to have, these big piles of bat poop, but usually a little pile of guano isn't gonna be that bad for your health, It's probably not good to have any animal poop just laying around, but you know, if it's not a ton, like not big piles, it's probably not going to hurt you. But yeah, you know, it's probably better for the bats to be living outside than inside your house.
Absolutely. You said that that we think that the white nose syndrome fungus came from Europe or Asia. Does the white nose syndrome affect bat populations, you know, globally or across the world?
So that's something that they've been doing a lot of research into, but it doesn't look like it really negatively impacts the bats over there. And it could be that either, you know, they've evolved to deal with it, or that, you know, just the circumstances aren't the same, you know, with temperatures and stuff like that to make it as big of a threat.
Okay. Are there any known treatments or preventatives for white nose syndrome? Are there any thoughts or efforts to administer them? So, and I think you had talked about this, but is there any way to sort of treat or to help the bats?
So of course, this is something that scientists have been working nonstop on since it was discovered. And they're trying a lot of different things. For example, they're trying to, you know, control the temperature in caves, and they might be adjusting it or creating even artificial roosts that don't have any of the spores present. But as far as preventative measures, I mean, they've tried all different kinds of things. I believe right now, actually, they're doing some vaccination trials on some bats out west to see whether a vaccine they created will prevent the bats from getting white nose. So there's definitely a lot of stuff in the works that we're trying. It's just hard because, you know, to vaccinate a single bat when they're roosting in these caves that can be, you know, 100,000 bats doesn't really make sense. So they're kind of trying to figure out something that can help, you know, a big population of bats all at once. So it's definitely, we're working on it.
Appreciate it. And just one last really quickly, we're out of time, but somebody said that they saw what looked like a big brown bat flying during the daytime, and wanted to know if you know, this was common or uncommon to see a bat flying at day or during the day.
So bats sometimes will fly during the day, especially if, you know, say they're roosting somewhere and they get disturbed. You know, they're not afraid to fly away and find somewhere else to go. And bats usually, they come out around dusk, so it's not totally dark yet when they come out. And they actually, you know, come out. They'll go take a nap during the night. They'll come out again. So they're really active mostly at dusk and at dawn. But I wouldn't say it's that much of a concern to see like one single bat flying during the day. It could just be that something scared the bat and it was like, oh, I got to get out of here. Or it could have, you know, been migrating. There's probably a lot of different reasons, but wouldn't panic.
No worries. Well, thank you once more to Elise Stanmyer for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being here. Our final presentation of the day is Birds of Prey. So, Elise, thanks.